Ok. Accomodatevi quelli che entrano e forse possiamo utilmente cominciare. Prego, accomodatevi, c'è posto ancora. E chi ha bisogno della traduzione, naturalmente il discorso di Wolfgang Blau sarà in inglese, ma c'è la disponibilità di avere delle cuffie per la traduzione simultanea, lì nell'angolo all'entrata della sala. Prego. Intanto benvenuti a tutti quanti, siamo tutti, in realtà tutti quanti benvenuti in questo posto e siamo tutti felici di esserci perché il Festival del giornalismo e Perugia sono ormai un appuntamento per i giornalisti e per chi si interessa di riflessione intorno al giornalismo non solo italiano ma internazionale, quale appunto è e vuole essere questo festival. Io sono Mario Tedeschini Lalli, sono il vice direttore per l'innovazione e lo sviluppo del gruppo Espresso, ma sono anche qui in particolare come co-presidente del Comitato Internazionale dell'Online News Association e sono molto grato agli organizzatori del festival che mi hanno fatto la cortesia e dato il privilegio di essere qui per introdurre un caro amico e un bravo giornalista, Wolfgang Blau, che è qui alla mia destra, che ha delle cose abbastanza provocatorie da raccontarci e da proporci oggi. Wolfgang Blau è attualmente il direttore delle strategie digitali per il Guardian News and Media Group, che è naturalmente l'editore del quotidiano, mi verrebbe da dire britannico, ma con molte virgolette intorno a questa parola, che tutti conosciamo. Molte virgolette intorno a questa parola perché, come sappiamo bene, il Guardian, come molte altre testate, come alcune altre testate britanniche, stanno diventando e stanno applicando una strategia di mondializzazione molto intensa e molto forte. Prima di diventare direttore digitale del Guardian, Wolfgang Blau è stato direttore di zeitonline.de, cioè del prodotto editoriale digitale della casa editrice del famoso settimanale tedesco di Zeit, e con zeitonline.de ha conquistato lui, ma insomma diciamo tutta la sua redazione naturalmente. Ma dice...
I'm good, thank you.
La redazione di zeitonline.de ha vinto numerosi premi internazionali per la sperimentazione di forme di giornalismo digitale molto avanzate. Prima di essere chiamato a dirigere Zeit Online, Wolfgang Blau ha lavorato per molti anni, dal 1999 al 2007, in Silicon Valley come freelance intorno prevalentemente, anche se non esclusivamente, alle questioni tecnologiche che naturalmente in quel periodo erano molto importanti, scrivendo e producendo materiali per alcune delle più grandi testate tedesche come Die Welt, la rete televisiva ZDF e la rete di syndication radiofonica VLR Radiodienst. Precedentemente è stato fondatore di Audible.de, che poi è stato acquisito da Amazon e e tante altre cose anche precedentemente, ma diciamo andiamo un po' troppo forse nel passato. La cosa interessante è che Wolfgang è quindi evidentemente un giornalista digitale sia perché ha osservato la rivoluzione digitale in uno dei luoghi principi dove questa rivoluzione si è manifestata, e che poi ha a sua volta cercato di applicare e cercato di tirarne le conseguenze come giornalista attivo nelle testate per le quali ha lavorato e che ha diretto. Io non voglio naturalmente togliere troppo tempo alla cosa più importante, che è il discorso di Wolfgang, tranne che per sottolineare il fatto che dalla sua esperienza, uso una parola che di solito si usa in contesti diversi, la sua esperienza multinazionale o comunque internazionale, ha probabilmente acquisito una sensibilità per i problemi del giornalismo, o diciamo in senso più generale dell'informazione della cittadinanza, che vanno al di là delle barriere, delle frontiere, usiamo questa parola più precisamente, delle frontiere tradizionali di lingua, delle frontiere tradizionali di cultura e a maggior ragione delle frontiere tradizionali delle nazioni. È, diciamo, in un qualche modo forse l'incarnazione stessa di una vocazione ibrida, vogliamo dire in un certo senso, del giornalismo nella sua fase digitale, e la sua riflessione intorno ai grandi o viceversa piccoli player internazionali nel campo del giornalismo si è fatta in questi mesi molto più intensa. Ha scritto, ha parlato, ha partecipato a delle tavole rotonde, recentemente una organizzata a Berlino esattamente su questo tema, e quindi senza por tempo in mezzo credo che dobbiamo dare semplicemente il benvenuto a Wolfgang Blau e al suo discorso che ha come tema, e lo dico in inglese perché in inglese mi piace molto di più che non la traduzione in italiano: Still no pan-European media. Are we nuts? Prego, Wolf.
Tante grazie, Mario. Molto, molto gentile. Thank you so much for this very, very kind introduction. Make yourselves comfortable. This is a different kind of speech for myself as well. It's somewhat uncertain territory for me. I feel very comfortable when speaking about different futures for journalism, or mobile journalism, or cultural journalism, or have a good fight about the right metrics for digital newsrooms. Yet there is another topic that plagues me, almost haunts me since many years now, especially when I'm at journalism conferences. And I hope that maybe I find new answers being given the possibility here to speak at this, as I find, fantastic journalism festival in Perugia. And that question is, as Mario has already mentioned in introducing me, how can it be that in the EU, as the world's largest economy, with more than 500 million citizens, with a high degree of fluency in the English language, and a surprisingly high degree of identification with being European, and I'll come to those numbers later, how can it be that there is no single large media organization from the continent that addresses Europeans as such? And I know, of course, there are some smaller ones, but not a single one yet with considerable scale. And how can that be even now, while the Ukraine, as a country directly bordering the EU, as we speak, is on the brink of war, that there still is no pan-European media sphere to have discussions about what the right answers would be to that situation? And how can it be that at the same time, an ever-growing number of media organizations from outside the EU are rolling out local editions within various EU countries, and thus effectively have begun organizing a more international European media sphere, while most all of Europe's traditional publishers, especially the market leaders, focus on their old domestic markets? Doesn't that strike you as odd in 2014? In an age where we can distribute our journalism through the internet across Europe if we wanted to. But before I go into the details of why that should happen and why it also might not happen, I think it is important to put this question into a bigger, a cultural and also somewhat historic context. If you would read only American and British media these days, digital only or print or broadcast, you'd be led to think that the EU project is almost on its deathbed, and you would mostly perceive it as an economic project only. You also would not know how old this project is and how it just keeps coming back generation after generation. So yes, the euro might fail, and yes, even the EU itself, less likely so, but not impossible, might disintegrate during our lifetimes. But the cultural yearning and longing for a stronger, a more unified, a more democratic Europe has been in existence not only since the catastrophe of World War II and the Holocaust, but since several hundred years. And it would certainly not stop just because the euro might have failed. It would only come back and re-articulate itself in new ways, as it has done so many times already. And I'm emphasizing this because this much wider definition of the European idea beyond the economics gives our discussion today of a pan-European media sphere in the digital space a more precise context than simply attaching such journalistic ventures to the fate of the euro or of institutions like the European Commission. So with your permission, let me illustrate this a little bit more. And back there, if you would like to sit down, feel free to make yourselves comfortable. There are enough seats available still. Dante, here in Italy, one of Italy's and Europe's greatest poets and thinkers, wrote already in the early 1300s, 700 years ago, about the advantages of a Europe that was unified under one emperor and that provided better citizen rights at that time, a better separation of church and state. And then in the early 1600s, the French Duke of Sully wrote a detailed outline for his friend, King Henri IV, for how to reorganize Europe into 15 states of equal strength and with a joint army. One of the most astounding proposals then came from the Englishman William Penn in 1693. He was the wealthy son of a British admiral, but he himself became a Quaker, was persecuted for this religious choice, and then argued for creating, as he called it, the United States of Europe, more than 70 years before the founding of the United States of America. Eventually, as so often, William Penn moved to America and then was the founder of Pennsylvania and the city of Philadelphia. But what was so baffling about William Penn is that he anticipated many of today's European institutions. There are many more stories like this, whether it is the German philosopher Immanuel Kant in the late 1700s, or French poet Victor Hugo, or the Italian journalist and revolutionary Giuseppe Mazzini in the 1800s, who all thought about the creation of what both Hugo and Mazzini called the United States of Europe. From the historic beginning, just like today, a unified Europe has always been the object of love and fear, and the projection screen for all kinds of hopes and concerns across the political spectrum, that it would diminish or that it would increase cultural diversity, that it would bring more justice or rather only benefit those who were already wealthy and powerful, should be a very familiar theme from today. And even today's discussion whether Turkey and Russia should be part of such a union or federation has already been discussed by William Penn in 1693. So, while in today's media, the narrative of the EU is mostly framed as something that has just started somehow after World War II, with France and Germany as its nucleus, and with industrial cooperation and not citizens' rights at the heart of it, unifying Europe has in fact been a theme and a dream for many, many hundred years before that, and not just after World War II. Already after World War I, there were pan-Europa conferences like the one in Vienna in 1926, with more than 2,000 European politicians taking part in it. There was another competing pan-Europa Union that was critical of the UK, and another one that said, no, we have to cooperate with the UK and with the United States as well. There were industrial associations that already spoke of a European Union, those mostly interested in free trade. All very familiar themes from today. So you might wonder, why am I making such a point of this historic context while we discuss potential digital media startups in Europe today? And what does it have to do with each other? I think if you as a journalist or as an entrepreneur ponder going into that space of publishing for a European audience, the first thing you will hear from potential investors, friends, advisors is something like that. Well, isn't that EU thing kind of over? Does anyone care? Who is interested anyways? And I think that is especially because journalists equate Europe with the euro and the EU institutions, and not with the much larger, much more resilient theme of Europe perceiving itself as a cultural entity. And by doing so, you easily miss the bigger theme with the deep roots in the psyche of this continent. Even if the euro disintegrates, the cultural search for Europe will not go away. And since the advent of social media is not dependent anymore on traditional media as its platform of expression. As an example to illustrate that a little bit, when I recently commissioned a routine audience survey with our fantastic research team at The Guardian, and we asked our readers across Europe whether they wanted more or less coverage of certain topics, it was striking how my framing of the question led to very different results. When I asked for more coverage of the EU, responses from across Europe were okay, but not enthusiastic. When I dropped the term EU and asked instead whether we should cover Europe more strongly, the interest in coverage of European culture, politics, science, lifestyle, tech, and sport was very, very strong. Why? I think because only the latter formulation addressed our readers as Europeans, which is mostly defined through shared cultural themes and stories, and not through their support for current institutions of the EU, such as the Euro or the European Commission. Also, if you're looking into this space as a journalist or as an entrepreneur or both, make sure you study the annual Eurobarometer surveys that are being paid for but not conducted directly by the European Commission since 1973, one of the world's largest body of survey data. What might strike you when you look at these numbers is that when being asked whether the EU should develop into a federation of nation states, only the surveys in Finland, Sweden, and Denmark show strong 70% majorities against this idea. All other member states, including the UK still, show no votes between 18 and 50%, and yes votes between 27 and 60%. I have to slow down for our translators. With Italy at a support rate of 40%, Germany 51%, France 53%, and Poland 60%. When not asking, though, about EU institutions, the euro or EU policies, but about personal identities, the feedback suddenly is much more positive. And remember, for our question here, whether to produce journalism that addresses readers not only as Italians, Germans, or Spaniards, but also as Europeans, parallel to their regional or national identities, this question of perceiving yourself as Europeans is much more important than whether you support European institutions or not. So when being asked, do you feel you are a citizen of the EU? In 23 of the 28 member states, the majority of respondents says yes, with the share of yes answers ranging between 53 and 85%. And of all Eurobarometer questions, this is the one that focuses most on identity. The lowest share of respondents who feel they are citizens of the EU are, interestingly enough, in Greece and in the UK, with only 42% each. If you're interested in these numbers, I have tweeted that chart earlier today. You can find it under my Twitter account, or if you just look for the hashtag of this conference. To me, these numbers are in somewhat stark contrast to the EU coverage of most national news organizations who tend to frame Europa mostly in the context of the euro crisis or the context of a need for institutional reform, but who tend to ignore issues of European identity altogether. Amongst the news organizations in Europe, most national market leaders in Europe still think in categories of domestic and foreign, or home and world, and other EU countries often get the same amount of attention as any overseas country or less. And there is no Europe section in between, and if there is one, it solely focuses on European politics, but doesn't give emphasis to European culture, European sports, European science, or other topical ranges. Which raises the question, are national news organizations, especially the traditional ones with rich traditions and heritages, are national news organizations, maybe even compared to their own readers, especially vulnerable of being over-invested into the concept of the nation state? And is maybe their preferred allocation of teams in their national capitals inevitably leading them to an overemphasis on domestic affairs and an undercoverage of European affairs? At the same time, while European governments often have to overemphasize their power and pretend as if they can sculpt many more of daily politics than they actually can in these days. The comparatively low percentage of British respondents who feel that they are citizens of the EU highlights also another peculiar journalistic and tactical challenge for the EU. The image of the EU around the world, but also within Europe, is mostly being shaped by media organizations from the UK and the US due to their much larger reach in the English language sphere, such as The Economist, Financial Times, Wall Street Journal, New York Times, The Guardian, BBC, Reuters, and Bloomberg. And obviously, all of these are excellent publications and organizations. I'm working for one of them, proudly so. But it is still an oddity, if not even reckless, as a situation that the world's largest economy by population, third largest entity, has no continental player to also shape and frame that global perception of the EU. Even as an opponent of the EU, I think you should have an interest in this debate being carried out within the European media sphere more actively than anywhere else. To be a bit more specific and add some numbers, these are Comscore numbers. Of the world's top 25 online news properties, ranked by the size of their readership, guess how many are from Europe? The world's top 25. 11 are from the US, 11 are from China, 3 are from the UK, and not a single one is from the European continent. So what has been done practically towards maybe creating pan-European media platforms? What worked and what has failed? Because of course there are some small ones already, and many people have put whole careers into building such. One of the most noteworthy one was the newspaper with the title The European, started by the British newspaper magnate Robert Maxwell shortly after the Berlin Wall fell in 1990. Had an 8 or 9 year long life. At its best time, it had a circulation of around 200,000 copies. But it most likely was too early for its time, or maybe also had this, what Jay Rosen calls the view from nowhere. It didn't have a home, and it was this assumption that now that there's the internet and that it's easier to distribute newspapers across the continent, you wouldn't have to address local identities anymore as well. They then tried to become a business publication, but that didn't work either. Another example with a strong footprint in Europe is The Economist, the most sold non-German print publication in Germany at the newsstands, even more successful than the Turkish publications, which have significant readerships in Germany as well. And then there are other experiments like the local Swedish group of English-only sites across Europe. There's the Swiss project of 20 Minutes. There's also Press Europe that tries to translate content and exchange it. There's World Crunch that tries to do that on a global scale, and of course there's Euronews, which is very valuable, but also has not managed yet to build significant scale and a massive audience that would be needed. And then there are also really interesting alliances. There's the European Daily Alliance of center to conservative newspapers such as Germany's Die Welt, The Telegraph, Spain's ABC, and Le Figaro. And there's the Europa Alliance of The Guardian, Le Monde, El País, Süddeutsche Zeitung, and La Repubblica. And what they're doing is really valuable. They're exchanging content. They translate articles back and forth. They sometimes cooperate also on investigative projects. But in the end, the aim of these cooperations is to make your own coverage to your own domestic audience better and more informed. Really important, but not the same as building a pan-European media sphere. What is new? And why do I feel such an urge to have this discussion with you all? What is new is that there are new players such as BuzzFeed and the Huffington Post. And you better take them serious. If your chief editor or your board still makes jokes about listicle content or BuzzFeed, chances are they're missing the bigger picture. such as that BuzzFeed already is going upmarket and is hiring world-class journalists, is doing fantastic work in covering Syria, for instance, in other regions of the world. BuzzFeed has not only gone into Australia and Brazil recently, but also into the UK, Spain, and France, and is one of the world's top 20 news sites with audiences already. The Huffington Post has set up editions with teams on the ground in Spain, Italy, Germany, France, and the UK, as well as in Japan, Korea, Brazil, Canada, and other countries, and is one of the world's top 5 media properties already online. The Canadian publisher Vice runs local editions for Belgium, Czech Republic, Denmark, Germany, Spain, France, Greece, Italy, the Netherlands, Sweden, Austria, Poland, Portugal, and Romania. And then there's, as I said, one of the older players, The Economist, who also has a print circulation in Europe of about 245,000 copies. The New York Times also has rebranded its Herald Tribune, is doing some significant marketing across Europe. And then, of course, there's The Guardian, which is not investing yet into European audiences, but even without doing so, also has a good-sized audience of about 30 million visits a month. And this audience strikes me because it has very, very good metrics in regards to engagement, frequency of visits, page views per visit, session times, and things like that. I could continue this list, but one shared characteristic of all of these media brands should have become sufficiently obvious to you already. Every single one of these news organizations that are investing into building pan-European audiences and businesses is either from the United States, from Canada, or from the UK. There is not a single news organization from the continental 27 EU countries that is expanding with similar ambitions. And to make sure one thing, there's nothing wrong with American media expanding into Europe. Quite the opposite. If it takes an American like Arianna Huffington or a Canadian like Vice co-founder Shane Smith to help organize a pan-European public, more power to them. Welcome. And as a Guardian journalist, I also have to say that my appreciation for American press freedom and the First Amendment in the US has only increased during this last year of covering the NSA files by my colleagues. My speech is not about EU versus US. I consider myself half American. My wife and my children are American citizens. But what I'm trying to address today is this question, how we can have a pan-European public and a shared voice and many voices across Europe that are being heard internationally. So what has been tried? What are the challenges and why has this not happened yet? Of course, there's some very obvious and maybe some less obvious reasons. We have already covered the identity issue. I think that is being overrated. But then there's the language issue. But again, there are many trustworthy surveys that show that at least 50% of the 500 million EU citizens are able to have an English-speaking conversation. So if you reach your limits of your business because of a lack of English speakers in Europe, you already have a luxury problem. That should not hold you back. Then there's the importance of scale. While for a long time there was this misperception that publishing digitally somehow costs less than publishing in print, it might be quite the opposite. We're seeing a concentration in the market that requires ever more technical staff, ever more data scientists to be competitive with your various apps, to have all the right tools to measure audience, to train your journalists, to run a news operation at 24/7, which is what you have to do, especially in regards to what's happening in the mobile space. So there's an advantage of scale of these global players. There's also a cultural mindset that I think gives North American players an advantage. A North American has a very different understanding of what is a small and what is a big country. I think in most European countries, the local citizens somehow think their own country is big. And that illusion usually ends when you meet a YouTube manager who says she or he is in charge for Europe, Middle East, and Africa. It's the EMEA syndrome that is always baffling, slightly provocative, but oftentimes even justified. So it doesn't surprise me that someone like BuzzFeed or Arianna Huffington say, let's do Europe in that formulation, and that we don't. And then there's the other point that as a successful domestic market leader in Germany or Italy or France or any other country, oftentimes that has been achieved by weaving yourself into the fabric of your country to the point of calling yourselves La Repubblica or the country, El País. or La Nación, the nation. So it's difficult from that mindset now to expand that. And maybe there's also an unconscious conflict of interest, because in the end, if that, what sounds now like a very hypothetical goal, but if we should ever really reach a full-on European Union or a United States of Europe, inevitably that would make today's market leaders in each nation regional players. And only a few of them would make it to the next league of becoming pan-European forces to reckon with. But I'm not sure if that is on the mind of those people making these decisions. Big issue, elephant in the room, revenue. What would be the business model of something like that? Of course, if you look at the flight of European startups, how they go to the US as soon as they're taking off, it's obvious. It's a large, homogenized, affluent market versus a highly fragmented European market. So how do you sell ads, for instance, across 27 European nations? Is there even a client? Is there even something like a pan-European ad buy? I think it will be a question of time, but from everything I could see, it doesn't exist yet in terms of an agency structure. Maybe Google, with its double-click infrastructures, is the closest thing to that. Then there's a mobile dynamic that I have touched already briefly. We see something that sometimes does keep me awake at night, which is that on desktop, our readers are very eclectic. They often visit 6, 7, 10 sites within one typical lunchtime session. And on mobile, that spectrum shrinks dramatically. And in terms of active apps, which apps usually have the more engaged, more loyal users, more page views per visit, longer session times, more comments, all that, in apps, usually the portfolio shrinks down to 1 or 2 apps maximum. So on apps, suddenly, you really have to do everything. You want to do what differentiates you in terms of reportage, opinion, analysis, all that makes you different from your competitors, but you also have to do the breaking news piece really well. And that, again, leads to a market concentration because only a few very large organizations can do that. Staff is another issue. I'm a vice president of the Global Editors Network. I'm visiting a lot of newsrooms around the world. And I seem to notice in pretty much every newspaper newsroom, but also television newsroom I visit, is that their staff is ethnically, culturally more homogeneous than the rest of their country. And if there's one thing you usually don't find is, especially in European newsrooms, are colleagues and journalists from other European countries. We don't have enough bilingual staff. We don't have enough in any European newsroom that I'm aware of, enough staff to really identify topics that are relevant in other European countries and that could even be relevant to your own home country earlier than the wire services and mostly through social media. That is a training issue, but also an issue of maybe redefining some of our diversity policies. At The Guardian, we have these really fantastic product managers, and I have learned a lot from them in that year that I'm now working with them. And oftentimes I come and find one of them and say, you know, we have to really rework this video player in this or that way. And eventually in these discussions, she or he, whoever I'm speaking with, turns quiet. And I see these wrinkles show up on their forehead and they look to the ceiling and then they say, yeah, but what problem are you trying to solve? And I have made that part of my own persona. So I have that inner product manager now that also in this question says, yeah, Wolfgang, but what problem are you actually trying to solve? Is there really a need for this in Europe? And I wasn't so sure for a while. As I said, this question haunts me for quite some years now. But there were these nights in early last summer, briefly after I joined The Guardian, where I have this bad habit of working long hours, and the Snowden stories, mostly the NSA stories, were mostly published from the US for legal reasons from a certain point on, so we published them late at night, UK time. And whenever that happened, I went into the newsroom and tried to help, mostly through running our social media accounts or something like that during these nights. And without fail, in the early weeks, the same thing happened, is we published our story on the Guardian website, and when you imagine you're watching Europe from space at night, you saw these lights flicker. Le Monde published it immediately as well. Spiegel followed, La Repubblica published it, Zeit Online, Süddeutsche Zeitung, Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, Standard in Austria, El País. And yet the British Island, except for The Guardian, was dark. The story didn't exist for the Telegraph for a long time. The BBC was very timid for a long time. The Economist still isn't so sure of what to make of the story. And when then the threats increased that Alan Rusbridger now has spoken about quite a lot, I suddenly realized this is a serious threat. This British government could care less what The Guardian thinks. They're really threatening us. And then noticed my relief about other European journalists covering this issue and creating this pan-European public that did put some pressure on the Cameron government. And then I thought of other stories where I noticed similar things but hadn't put them into context. In 2009, there was a time when, as a German journalist at that time working in Germany, you didn't even know anymore whether it was worth covering one more scandal in European politics around Silvio Berlusconi. It felt almost futile. He seemed to have such a tight grip on Italian media. And then came El País, publishing these pictures that shed a different light on Berlusconi's private transgressions. And suddenly there was this extra Italian, European leverage appearing that put Berlusconi under considerable pressure, as you all know. Or when you remember what happened in Hungary with Prime Minister Viktor Orban trying to diminish press freedom in Hungary, and other European journalists making this an issue like they wouldn't have, and they wouldn't have been noticed without the internet 10, 15 years prior to that. So I think there is a need, coming back to that product manager's question inside of me, what problem are you trying to solve? Last year it was The Guardian. Next year it could be any one of you. I think it is, as journalists, in all of your interest that there's a stronger pan-European exchange and maybe even a pooling of resources. So societal value, I think, is big. User interest to be tested, but many of us already notice significant audiences in other European countries. Oftentimes they are being deducted in your national rankings because they are of no commercial value yet, as is the practice in Germany, but that could change. And then thirdly, another business interest, which is the interest in building scale. One of the things that surprised me when I joined The Guardian, I just wasn't aware of it at full scale, is how much journalism currently is in the process of globalizing. Not in terms of speaking to a global audience, but internationalizing. How I always thought that languages would somehow protect us, but now we see younger readers very naturally reading English-speaking websites of NHK during the Fukushima catastrophe, reading The Guardian, reading the New York Times and other publications around the world. And from my perspective, if we are lucky, eventually in this global set of top 10, there should at least be 1 or 2 publications from the continent. So I think there's a business interest, but when you look at what BuzzFeed and Huffington Post are doing in Europe, they actually, I think, don't have a European strategy. They have a global strategy, and Europe is a sideshow. But what they learn is rolling out in local markets with very nimble structures, using the advantages of scale of their globally compatible content and adding a thin veneer of local content. And they learn this while we don't, and that is something that should concern us. More positively, how could this maybe work? And that is where I really genuinely hope for your input, your ideas today, but also later on through Twitter or any other medium through which you might want to contact me. Maybe, as I said, maybe the old domestic brands are too invested into their markets, have too much to lose. Maybe it would be better to think about new digital-only players, such as the Correspondent project in the Netherlands, Carta in Germany, Mediapart in France, and many others, and I hope for your suggestions, to link them up and pool resources for that and decide we actually prefer the English language to reach scale more quickly. Maybe there's also a case for digital-only joint venture of traditional brands, but it would have to be a joint venture that is being given a high degree of autonomy. And then maybe, of course, as always, there are the public broadcasters. Many Americans won't believe if I tell them that Germany's public broadcasting system alone, when I checked last, had a combined annual budget of more than 7 billion euros per year. And don't get me wrong, I'm all for there being public broadcasters online. I think we need them. But my sense is that politically their hands are so tight that we can't bank on, especially those also often politically advised, steered / directed entities reaching out to the rest of Europe at any time soon. In regards to the editorial positioning, what would that be? Would it focus only on Europe as a specialty topic, like Euractiv does already? They do great work since many years. Or would it have to appeal to a general audience and cover topics such as fashion and sport and science and European lifestyle? I would opt for the latter. When Pierre Omidyar announced his new venture with Glenn Greenwald and other fantastic colleagues, there was one thing that I found really noteworthy, is that he said, no, we're not just publish investigations. We don't just do investigative journalism. If you want impact with your investigative journalism, you have to build a mass audience that is interested in all kinds of things, because readers don't want to read investigative journalism every day. You need to find a gateway to actually present it to them. And this is coming from someone as a co-founder of eBay who has a deep understanding of audience behaviors and audience flow. And it really went counter to the gospel of unbundling that we all have been hearing now for so many years. So I think it should be a bundle that appeals to a mass audience. And then, I think what is a prerequisite, I've touched it already, employ more colleagues from other countries. You can't do that with a staff that is 95% domestic, as is the case in most European countries right now. But again, I did not intend to deliver a solution or a business plan today, but I wanted to highlight really two issues. Being a market leader in an individual EU country might be a short pleasure, a very profitable pleasure, but a short pleasure, given what is happening in the mobile space and given the global players' fast learning curve at how to localize at low cost. And second, as journalists, we should have an interest in having more leverage on our governments, on lobbyists, of which there are plenty in the EU and in Brussels, and we should increase our leverage by allying with media from other EU countries who have many more joint journalistic interests than we might think. In closing, I'd like to mention one incident from Italian history that encapsulates much of what I'm trying to express. In the mid-1800s, when the journalist and revolutionary Giuseppe Mazzini, together with Giuseppe Garibaldi and so many other women and men, were fighting for a united Italy and a more democratic Italy, one of their main opponents, the Habsburg Empire's foreign minister, the infamous Duke Metternich, wrote to his staff, I quote, "The word Italy is only a geographical expression, a description which is useful shorthand but has none of the political significance the efforts of the revolutionary ideologues try to put on it, and which is full of dangers for the very existence of the states which make up the peninsula." Today, only 160 years later, Italy is not only a G8 power and one of the world's strongest and most envied nation brands for all kinds of luxury products and tourism. We also can hardly imagine that Italy as political entity has ever not been understood as something evident and logical and almost natural. So whether the EU further integrates or not, I feel certain by now that the idea of there not being a single pan-European media outlet from the continent, that this idea will one day soon be something that will sound as flawed and backwards as Metternich's thoughts on Italy in his days. Because identities, collective, societal identities, as well as our own professional and private identities have a tendency to present themselves as eternal and cohesive, partially also because our brains are wired to create narratives and causalities, even if there aren't any. Yet, individuals and societies that achieve greatness are those who have a compass of values, but who also have the confidence and the courage to embrace the fact that identities are, in fact, something very, very fluid. Thank you so much. Good luck to you all, and let's stay in touch about this question. Thank you. Thank you.
Molto bene, grazie mille a Wolfgang. Naturalmente adesso abbiamo molta carne al fuoco che è stata messa da Wolfgang Blau e credo che valga la pena di... scusate, devo... Ecco. Di discuterne un pochino, perché per quanto enormemente affascinante il quadro e devo dire convincente nella sua parte analitica, il quadro che ci è stato presentato, che è un quadro sostanzialmente di mancanze, no? Forse di opportunità mancate, io continuo, ho dei dubbi, forse ne hanno anche altri, o forse invece abbiamo suscitato degli entusiasmi. Allora ci piacerebbe, veramente io mi tengo i miei dubbi e le mie domande per dopo eventualmente, ma se ci sono appunto domande, chi è che ha il microfono è lì, qualcuno vuole lì, benissimo.
Herr Kollege Blau, I also work in the UK for BBC Scotland, and we did a news piece here in Italy recently, and I asked people what their identity were, and several people came up saying they were Venetian, they were Italians, but they were also European. I've asked the same question since in the UK. I've not had a single person telling me they felt European. So I'm surprised that your number, I think it was 42%.
Me too, yeah.
Maybe, as you said yourself, it depends on how you ask the question. I don't know. And the other question I was going to ask, I'm also surprised that you only briefly mentioned Euronews. They claim themselves, don't they, that they are the most watched news channel in Europe. So are they not a pan-European media?
Regarding Euronews, I think I mentioned them and Euractiv as well. And they also made sure I would by tweeting to me before this speech already, but I would have done anyways because I think they are pioneers. I must say I don't understand the television market sufficiently to speak about it, so I stayed away from that realm because there's a whole other thing going on, because you could then also look at what Deutsche Welle is doing, how they try to reposition themselves, enter that race again for framing perceptions and themes around the world, look at what Russia Today is doing right now, what CCTV is also doing, which you shouldn't dismiss. They do some really interesting and actually good journalism when not covering Chinese issues. So I just didn't want to comment on Euronews. They have, in my 5 years as a chief editor in Germany, never appeared with setting an agenda or raising an issue that we would have to position ourselves towards.
Domanda là.
Hi, Tony Hale from Chartbeat here. So Britain, America, Australia all also have common culture, common history, common language, and I know certainly some of my ancestors tried very hard for political integration as well. And yet, when The Guardian wanted to expand into those two areas, they focused on building their own kind of newsrooms in those areas, focusing on their own homepages, and so forth. So as you think about a kind of pan-European body in this, do you think that the same thing has to happen? Do you think you have to have independent newsrooms in the different countries creating their own versions of the homepages, or can you have a truly pan-European voice and newsroom?
I think the joint interests beyond living in the same time zone and working across borders and doing most of our trade across borders within Europe, we shouldn't even call it foreign trade to a certain extent. I think you can't really compare the 27 continental EU countries with the similarities in interests of, let's say, Australia, the US, and the UK, but that is a very commonwealthy question of you to ask. So no, I think it's a different case, and of course, there is not much of a pan-Australian, American, British ad market also in regards to the business models. I think if you want to reach significant scale in any country, you have to be seen as of that region. while at the same time taking advantage of your scale of being a global organization. So definitely that is important for us in the US. It is in Australia. And we're actually quite surprised. We just launched the Australian edition of The Guardian with a small team in Sydney and also in Canberra now and other locations only a year ago. And how high the share of our readers already is that seem to come to us as their, or at least one of their daily destinations that went fairly fast. But it also happened because we said, we are of Australia. We want to compete with the market leaders in Australia. I just think across Europe that's very different. So much of our cultural journalism, how El País or La Repubblica or Le Monde or The Guardian are reviewing Hollywood films. There are so many similarities in our European-shaped cognitive frames, how we look at these Hollywood movies, that I think we overestimate the cultural differences between these countries in many areas.
Se posso inserirmi in questa tua risposta, poi ovviamente sentiamo ancora altre domande. Cioè, tu pensi, quindi, mi attacco alla risposta a proposito del fatto che ci sono delle somiglianze culturali maggiori di quello che pensiamo, che noi possiamo avere, noi intendo qualunque cosa voglia dire noi, diciamo questa entità pan-europea di informazione, una propria voce, perché la sensazione che ho da lettore, oltre che da giornalista in questi decenni, è che una delle ragioni del grande successo internazionale, per esempio del The Economist, è che ha una propria voce, che è quella voce lì, che sia britannica o non britannica, non è questo il punto, ha certamente una voce. The Guardian ha una sua voce. Bene? Allora, pensi che sia possibile, come dire, definire a un certo punto, sia pur pragmaticamente, una voce europea?
I think that is the central question, because, and I don't have an answer to it. What I see, though, is that The Economist is distinctively British. It's not globalese. They try to avoid British colloquialism so that a global audience could understand them. But provenance is really important in journalism. I think it was British Airways once that said, we are a global airline, and they found out that they had to promptly rebrand themselves as genuinely British because provenance is important. And the UK also has an advantage in that. I think the UK is the world's largest exporter of journalism. If you look at the ratio of domestic readers versus non-domestic readers, we, especially Germany after World War II, German journalists have been trained by BBC journalists. So much of our definition of journalism comes from British journalists. So I wouldn't say that any of those British publications are not being perceived as genuinely British. And coming back to how a pan-European publication could work, you know, I fantasize. Sometimes I think we might even have to experiment with something like a traveling newsroom that sets up shop half a year in Athens and the next half year in Rome and the next half year in Helsinki to get rooted. It just like the EU, if it ever works out, will be something brand new and not modeled after the United States. And parliamentarism itself hopefully goes through a process of reinvention with the help of the internet. I also think that the concept of a newsroom and a headquarter maybe might look very different in 10, 15 years from now. We have to experiment. But of course, that might be a reason why this has not happened. Because again, I'm not saying we have to do this, or even more conveniently, someone else has to do that. I want to understand, why has this not happened yet? How could it happen? And do we agree that this makes the EU very, very vulnerable?
Posso fare un momento soltanto, portiamo il microfono al signore e poi un altro ce n'è qua e un altro là. Uno straw poll rapidissimo. Allora, delle persone in sala, vorrei vedere le mani delle persone che non sono native speakers, che siano italiani, spagnoli, tedeschi, giapponesi, quello che sia, che in questo momento non hanno le cuffie di traduzione. Allora, questo credo che in questo paese, ancora 10 anni fa, forse 15 anni fa, per essere più forse ottimisti, non sarebbe stato così. Quindi forse nulla di scientifico naturalmente in questo sondaggio, però vuol dire che evidentemente questo global English o no, questa stramba lingua globale sta in qualche maniera prendendo piede. Allora ci stava una domanda qui, prego.
Sì, c'entra appunto questa domanda. I put it in English though, so you all can understand. I am from Germany, and I was wondering why you are imagining a English-speaking European media, I think. Wouldn't it be better and reach a larger audience setting it up in the domestic languages? So that the same articles, the same content can be published in Italy in Italian, in Germany in German, in France in French, which probably would be important. May this be another road, probably?
Yes, I mean,
Can we perhaps,
of course, sorry.
Pigliamo 3 domande e poi facciamo la risposta. Prego, uno qua, uno là, non so qual è la precedenza, lo sapete voi, quindi...
My name is Raymond Franken. I'm a Dutch journalist. I've worked for American media for more than 15 years in Europe. And I got tired of the Americans, and I thought, if they can treat Europe as one continent, why can't we Europeans do that ourselves? And I put my money where my mouth is. I actually did set up a pan-European TV station, which turned out to be a web TV station a few years later, which now is the video service on Euractiv.com. I ran into a huge number of problems. The biggest one was the fact that the European institutions are still very dominant. If you want to get some money, you have to say what they, you have to pledge allegiance to the institutions. The European Commission is very skeptical. The European Parliament runs off with ideas. They created their own TV channel. So my advice to anyone looking at this project, try to find a way to finance this without depending on the European institutions. And then my real question to you, Wolfgang, is why doesn't The Guardian simply start with a European version of The Guardian? It can be online only, and I'm sure that you see a lot of people already coming to The Guardian news pages. I know there's a lot of colleagues also that I have in Brussels that subscribe to the New York Times. In this digital day and age, it's really possible, but why not have a European version of The Guardian?
Un'altra domanda ancora, poi facciamo le risposte.
Scusate, io parlerò in italiano così sono un pochino più chiara. E secondo voi, anche per il signor Tedeschini, se le istituzioni europee possono fare qualcosa per promuovere e dare un impulso a questa integrazione culturale, chiarendo sempre la differenza tra Europa e istituzioni europee? Cioè, c'è un modo per cui il Parlamento e la Commissione possono dare un impulso a una maggiore integrazione anche dei media?
Maybe we start with your question first. And it touches, of course, what our Dutch colleague just said, who advises to stay away from institutional funding from the EU. And yet at the same time, of course, you wonder if the EU can get Airbus off the ground, why couldn't they also get a pan-European media structure off the ground? I just looked at what happened to Press Europe recently, which was a fantastic project trying to nurture a pan-European public. And as far as I know, the European Commission just withdrew funding and they had to shut down. Personally, as a journalist, the idea of being funded by a kind of government body is always something I would shy away from and look for alternatives, because eventually you run into credibility issues no matter what. And it's not the same as building airplanes. What you just said, I want to thank you. Thank you for what you did for Euractiv and for your initiative, and also for what you said about The Guardian. The Guardian is not no news organization is ever as big as we want it to, but it has a size where we really want to focus on the next steps, and we just launched Australia a year ago. We have a large project in the United States going, and we don't want to get ahead of ourselves. I personally always look at what Patch.com did in the US, of rolling out into, 150 markets, without getting it right in a few markets first. So of course, that's what I'm dreaming of myself, that eventually we would arrive at doing that. But we also have to look at the business framework, and it's much more attractive as a business for all the reasons I've mentioned earlier to go into the US or also to go into Australia versus rolling out into Europe. And there's fantastic journalism in Europe already, as there is in the US and Australia. So I'm here, I'm talking about it, I'm thinking about it, but I don't think that anytime soon you will see The Guardian moving into that field. Right, that's Titus Gast, a much appreciated former colleague who's now working for a public broadcaster. Titus, I think your question about working in localized languages, yes, of course, but there are certain dynamics that speak against it. One is speed. The speed of the conversation in the social media sphere, I think, doesn't allow for the lengthy procedures of translation oftentimes. And I think it puts you into a different mindset as a journalist if you write in English with a pan-European audience in mind versus write in your own native language knowing someone will translate it. There are some fantastic translators, but oftentimes these translations come too late. The conversation, especially in the social sphere, has already moved on, or they don't convey what they conveyed in the initial text. So I'm all for translations, and I also think we shouldn't think of this as we should do it this way or that way. What we're missing is a whole ecosystem of localized projects and pan-European projects in French or Spanish, English, German, and other languages. But to start with, at scale, at the lowest possible cost, I would do it in English.
Se posso aggiungere, in particolare su questo argomento, io ho un'esperienza antica, diciamo predigitale, di esperimenti di questo genere e nelle redazioni nelle quali ho lavorato mi sono spesso occupato di traduzioni, cioè di utilizzazione di pezzi di syndication che venivano dall'estero e che dovevo rendere in italiano anche con l'aiuto di traduttori professionisti. Quindi oltre però al problema della velocità che Wolfgang ha giustamente indicato, c'è in realtà un problema culturale. Il famoso lost in translation è una sacrosanta verità. Io per 11 mesi, fra le altre cose, negli anni scorsi sono stato l'editor della versione in italiano del New York Times, che va con la Repubblica. Il problema di se tu traduci un articolo del New York Times, ma è la stessa cosa con un articolo del Guardian, con un articolo del Süddeutsche Zeitung, no? In italiano, proprio una bella traduzione professionale, raramente funziona, specialmente se è un pezzo di cronaca, un pezzo, no? Se è un pezzo, una feature molto così, molto tranquilla, che può anche funzionare. Se è un pezzo di cronaca, un reporting, un'analisi battente sulle cose che stanno avvenendo, di solito è molto complicato portare in italiano non soltanto le parole, ma proprio la cornice culturale, il contesto. Il giornalismo è tutto contesto. No? Allora, tradurre il contesto è difficile, quindi se io, quello che personalmente ritengo, a me affascina molto, appunto io sono stato, ho fatto anche esperienze diciamo non felici, ma insomma molto interessanti di questo genere nel passato, quindi mi interessa molto l'ipotesi, ma la mia personale idea è che se ci si riesce, se riusciamo a fare una cosa nuova, no? Che poi potrebbe pure avere, diciamo, delle traduzioni, ma che deve nascere appunto con una propria voce. La propria voce nasce almeno in una lingua, se non in un luogo. E quindi questa è la mia personale idea. E siccome sono stato interpellato a proposito delle istituzioni europee, io sono all for Europe and all for European institutions, però credo che come forse in parte diceva anche Wolfgang Blau, questo possa essere in certi casi un po' un problema. D'altra parte le istituzioni europee non solo come il collega prima citava, spesso vorrebbero veder riflesse ciò che loro fanno e dicono nei media che in qualche maniera sono da loro finanziati, e questo è un riflesso automatico del potere, anche del potere europeo naturalmente, ma per dire in termini culturali c'è una giusta sottolineatura delle specificità dei diversi Paesi membri e quindi delle diverse culture che questi Paesi membri esprimono, e quindi per esempio del multilinguismo delle istituzioni europee, che ha un suo valore oggettivamente, ma che evidentemente proprio adesso noi stiamo mettendo in discussione, se vogliamo forse immaginare un organo di stampa pan-europeo. La prima cosa che stiamo mettendo in discussione è proprio il multilinguismo. Quindi questo, diciamo, è un problema supplementare oltre a quelli che erano stati disegnati. Vedo una domanda qua e poi altri. Là in fondo ce n'è un'altra. Prego.
Thank you for your speech. It was really interesting to hear another positive idea about the potential of Europe and of the European community. But I was wondering if The Guardian is now willing to take up the challenge, and if public broadcasters are politically restrained, and if initiatives like Press Europe cannot get funding, who can do it? And do we need a kind of cultural change in order to achieve it? And what can trigger that? I know those are 3 questions, I'm really sorry.
Hello, I'm Giuseppe Roncari from the Scuola Walden, which is a school of journalism in Italy. My question is, don't you feel like we should need pan-European topics before thinking of a pan-European public, so something that really unites all the interests of Europeans over borders? Thank you.
Excuse me. These European colds.
C'è un'altra domanda per caso? Beh, intanto facciamo queste due.
So if I understood you right, last question you said, shouldn't we first define or identify pan-European topics before starting a pan-European publication? I'm of the mind that I can never find that out myself without my readers. That I wouldn't know how to do that on some abstract drawing board. Of course, there's surveys, there's market research, but eventually you have to give it a shot and try out and start nimble. And I think some of them are fairly obvious. There's so much culture that we share, cultural coverage that we share. Sport is a massive issue across Europe, and interest in various sport leagues. And not just, and that's also coming back to the language issue, there's not just an inner European interest in these European topics, there's also global interest in Italian soccer, in European fashion, which also speaks for doing something like this in English to reach scale earlier. The other question was by you, if the large players don't do it, and the public broadcasters might not be flexible enough to do it, even if they want to possibly. I think I have lived long enough in the Silicon Valley to see this as an opportunity rather than as a detriment. Great, that there should be an opportunity. If the large players, the large actors are that handicapped, someone might be able to take advantage of exactly that.
Se posso aggiungere un po' nello stesso stile, non so la collega di che cosa si occupi in questo momento, ma vedendola in faccia e vedendo così grosso modo la sua età, direi provaci.
Let's talk.
Ancora qualcuno? Qualcuno ancora lì? Se posso aggiungere un momento soltanto, solo così, è una cosa minore, però circa 15 anni fa, nel 1999, un giovane italiano allora studente, adesso imprenditore a Silicon Valley, Adriano Farano, andò in Erasmus a fare un semestre a Strasburgo e decise che avrebbe fondato con alcuni amici una rete pan-europea di studenti che si chiamava e si chiama ancora Café Babel. Naturalmente stiamo parlando di altre cose, però stiamo parlando anche di 15 anni fa, ed evidentemente qualche opportunità ci sta. Prego.
Buongiorno, mi chiamo Alessio Briganti da Trieste. Non sono un giornalista, ma mi occupo di comunicazione. Nel nostro settore si considera con molta attenzione quello che è stato un po' un passaggio epocale, cioè dall'epoca dei mass media a quella che potrebbe essere l'attuale dei personal media. Allora mi volevo ricollegare un po' alla sua presentazione chiedendomi se forse non dovremmo unire due rivoluzioni contemporanee, contestuali, cioè quello di un'editoria che deve essere pensata per essere fruita in maniera molto diversa da quella del XX secolo e che quindi non passa solo più per gli old media ma attraverso i new media e viene fruita in un modo molto più personale dall'utenza, e dall'altro il problema di creare un pubblico che si veda rappresentato da questo tipo di editoria, quindi in qualche modo se serva un campione, un Steve Jobs dell'editoria che pensi, immagini questa comunicazione 2.0 che identifichi il continente europeo.
Ancora una domanda? Oppure, ecco, un'ultima domanda là e poi rispondiamo e poi naturalmente ci salutiamo per pranzo.
Hello, my name is Olga. I'm a journalist from Ukraine. You know, I've been following how the events in Ukraine were covered in both Italian press, because I read Italian, and in the English, in press in the English language. I also read a lot of German coverage. And you know what I noticed is that actually the coverage in every country is very different because of the interests of that country, which is completely normal. But the point is that don't you think it's a problem that the lack of the pan-European media is also hindering somehow, and it's an obstacle on the way of seeing like global threats that are now? Because what's happening now in Ukraine, it's not a local conflict, it's a pan-European, it's a global threat, but the lack of the common European vision in the media as well is somehow an obstacle towards developing a common strategy in Europe. Thank you.
That's a really interesting but also complicated question. Let me paraphrase it to make sure I understood you correctly. On the one hand, you say, what's the point of thinking about only building a pan-European media sphere if so many issues, you could add others, climate change, future of democracy, really are global issues? And then another one is you actually appreciated, if I got it right, the diversity of viewpoints in Europe. So I'm not sure how to answer that, but I'll try to share some of my thoughts around similar lines. One is diversity of viewpoints. That is one of, as I tried to describe already in the discussions in the 1600s, has been a discussion. Would that lead to less or more diversity? But I think what we can see so far, what the EU has done to regional languages, it has certainly done both, but it has helped foster cultural diversity. And I think any pan-European effort should also, of course, not be this standardized, harmonized, lifeless view from nowhere, Brussels as the worst case, but should make the full range of perspectives from across Europe visible. The other question, what's the need for a only pan-European view on so many of these global issues? That I find interesting because you hear that quite often from people that they say, yeah, I'm not even Italian, I'm Tuscan and I'm a global citizen. And eventually that often ends as soon as you live in Asia for a while or live in the US for a while and suddenly realize how much of a European you actually are. And that was the same for me. So many of us became Europeans while living in California or discovered that I should frame it less exclusively because, of course, you also become Americanized with all the wonderful benefits of that. But you discover that you share a lot with colleagues from France, Italy, Poland, and other places. So I think there is a need for that. You call it maybe could call it a mid-layer of joint European issues. I don't know if that answers or comes anywhere near answering your question, but I tried. And then there was the question for Steve Jobs. Well, yeah, waiting for Steve Jobs is always a somewhat convenient option. I don't know if I want to wait that long. But of course, what we could do is possibly do our best that the Steve Jobs that inevitably are around us don't get trampled on.
Benissimo, io ringrazio moltissimo prima di tutto Wolfgang Blau, ringrazio moltissimo ovviamente gli organizzatori del Festival del Giornalismo e ringrazio moltissimo questo pubblico che è stato molto attento e molto partecipe e questo credo che sia un tema, spero, onestamente non solo credo, ma spero che questo sia un tema che ci porteremo dentro e proveremo a rifletterci nei prossimi mesi, se non anni, speriamo mesi prima che anni. Grazie in particolare anche ai traduttori che ci hanno aiutato in questo lavoro e buon pranzo a tutti.
War, that there still is no pan-European media sphere to have discussions about what the right answers would be to that situation. And how can it be that at the same time an ever-growing number of media organizations from outside the EU are rolling out local editions within various EU countries and thus effectively have begun organizing a more international European media sphere while most all of Europe's traditional publishers, especially the market leaders, focus on their old domestic markets. Doesn't that strike you as odd in 2014? In an age where we can distribute our journalism through the internet across Europe if we wanted to. But before I go into the details of why that should happen and why it also might not happen, I think it is important to put this question into a bigger, a cultural and also somewhat historic context. If you would read only American and British media these days, digital only or print or broadcast, you'd be led to think that the EU project is almost on its deathbed, and you would mostly perceive it as an economic project only. You also would not know how old this project is and how it just keeps coming back generation after generation. So yes, the euro might fail, and yes, even the EU itself, less likely so, but not impossible, might disintegrate during our lifetimes. But the cultural yearning and longing for a stronger, a more unified, a more democratic Europe has been in existence not only since the catastrophe of World War II and the Holocaust, but since several hundred years. And it would certainly not stop just because the euro might have failed. It would only come back and re-articulate itself in new ways as it has done so many times already. And I'm emphasizing this because this much wider definition of the European idea beyond the economics gives our discussion today of a pan-European media sphere in the digital space a more precise context than simply attaching such journalistic ventures to the fate of the euro or of institutions like the European Commission. So with your permission, let me illustrate this a little bit more. And back there, if you would like to sit down, feel free to make yourselves comfortable. There are enough seats available still. Dante, here in Italy, one of Italy's and Europe's greatest poets and thinkers, wrote already in the early 1300s, 700 years ago, about the advantages of a Europe that was...
La redazione di zeitonline.de ha vinto numerosi premi internazionali per la sperimentazione di forme di giornalismo digitale molto avanzate. Prima di essere chiamato a dirigere Zeit Online, Wolfgang Blau ha lavorato per molti anni, dal 1999 al 2007, in Silicon Valley come freelance intorno prevalentemente, anche se non esclusivamente, alle questioni tecnologiche che naturalmente in quel periodo erano molto importanti, scrivendo e producendo materiali per alcune delle più grandi testate tedesche come Die Welt, la rete televisiva ZDF e la rete di syndication radiofonica BLR Radiodienst. Precedentemente è stato fondatore di Audible.de, che poi è stato acquisito da Amazon e tante altre cose anche precedentemente, ma diciamo andiamo un po' troppo forse nel passato. La cosa interessante è che Wolfgang è quindi evidentemente un giornalista digitale sia perché ha osservato la rivoluzione digitale in uno dei luoghi principi dove questa rivoluzione si è manifestata, e che poi ha a sua volta cercato di applicare e cercato di tirarne le conseguenze come giornalista attivo nelle testate per le quali ha lavorato e che ha diretto. Io non voglio naturalmente togliere troppo tempo alla cosa più importante, che è il discorso di Wolfgang, tranne che per sottolineare il fatto che dalla sua esperienza, uso una parola che di solito si usa in contesti diversi, la sua esperienza multinazionale o comunque internazionale, ha probabilmente acquisito una sensibilità per i problemi del giornalismo, o diciamo in senso più generale dell'informazione della cittadinanza, che vanno al di là delle barriere, delle frontiere, usiamo questa parola più precisamente, delle frontiere tradizionali di lingua, Intanto benvenuti a tutti quanti, siamo tutti, in realtà tutti quanti benvenuti in questo posto e siamo tutti felici di esserci, perché il Festival del giornalismo e Perugia sono ormai un appuntamento per i giornalisti e per chi si interessa di riflessione intorno al giornalismo non solo italiano ma internazionale, quale appunto è e vuole essere questo festival. Io sono Mario Tedeschini Lalli, sono il vice direttore per l'innovazione e lo sviluppo del Gruppo Espresso, ma sono anche qui in particolare come co-presidente del Comitato Internazionale dell'Online News Association, e sono molto grato agli organizzatori del festival che mi hanno fatto la cortesia e dato il privilegio di essere qui per introdurre un caro amico e un bravo giornalista, Wolfgang Blau, che è qui alla mia destra, che ha delle cose abbastanza provocatorie da raccontarci e da proporci oggi. Wolfgang Blau è attualmente il direttore delle strategie digitali per il Guardian News and Media Group, che è naturalmente l'editore del quotidiano, mi verrebbe da dire britannico, ma con molte virgolette intorno a questa parola che tutti conosciamo. Molte virgolette intorno a questa parola perché, come sappiamo bene, il Guardian, come molte altre testate, come alcune altre testate britanniche, stanno diventando e stanno applicando una strategia di mondializzazione molto intensa e molto forte. Prima di diventare direttore digitale del Guardian, Wolfgang Blau è stato direttore di zeitonline.de, cioè del prodotto editoriale digitale della casa editrice del famoso settimanale tedesco di Zeit, e con la con siteonline.de ha conquistato lui, ma insomma diciamo tutta la sua redazione naturalmente. Ma dice...
I'm good, thank you.
Tradizionale di cultura e a maggior ragione delle frontiere tradizionali delle nazioni. È, diciamo, in un qualche modo forse l'incarnazione stessa di una vocazione ibrida, vogliamo dire in un certo senso, del giornalismo nella sua fase digitale, e la sua riflessione intorno ai grandi o viceversa piccoli player internazionali nel campo del giornalismo si è fatta in questi mesi molto più intensa. Ha scritto, ha parlato, ha partecipato a delle tavole rotonde, recentemente una organizzata a Berlino esattamente su questo tema, e quindi senza por tempo in mezzo credo che dobbiamo dare semplicemente il benvenuto a Wolfgang Blau e al suo discorso che ha come tema, e lo dico in inglese perché in inglese mi piace molto di più che non la traduzione in italiano: Still no pan-European media. Are we nuts? Prego, Wolf.
Tante grazie, Mario. Molto gentile. Thank you so much for this very, very kind introduction. Make yourselves comfortable. This is a different kind of speech for myself as well. It's somewhat uncertain territory for me. I feel very comfortable when speaking about different futures for journalism, or mobile journalism, or cultural journalism, or have a good fight about the right metrics for digital newsrooms. Yet there is another topic that plagues me, almost haunts me since many years now, especially when I'm at journalism conferences. And I hope that maybe I find new answers being given the possibility here to speak at this, as I find, fantastic journalism festival in Perugia. And that question is, as Mario has already mentioned in introducing me, how can it be that in the EU, as the world's largest economy, with more than 500 million citizens, with a high degree of fluency in the English language, and a surprisingly high degree of identification with being European, and I'll come to those numbers later, how can it be that there is no single large media organization from the continent that addresses Europeans as such? And I know, of course, there are some smaller ones, but not a single one yet with considerable scale. And how can that be even now, while the Ukraine, as a country directly bordering the EU, as we speak, is on the brink of
Accomodatevi quelli che entrano e forse possiamo utilmente cominciare. Prego, accomodatevi, c'è posto ancora. E chi ha bisogno della traduzione, naturalmente il discorso di Wolfgang Blau sarà in inglese, ma c'è la disponibilità di avere delle cuffie per la traduzione simultanea, lì nell'angolo all'entrata della sala. Prego.